Our next speaker is ready. So we have Dr. Ellen Crocker, and she is going to provide a forest health update. So with that, I'll hand that to you, Ellen.
Wonderful. And can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, it's great to be joining you all. Sorry it's over Zoom instead of in person. But today I'm going to be giving a short update to just two things that are happening in our forests and woodlands. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the current situation with emerald ash borer, as well as our newest forest health invasive issue, and that's laurel wilt. So giving a little bit of information on both of those and hopefully staying within the allotted time. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about emerald ash borer, which isn't a new thing for our state, but it's new to parts of the state, especially the western part of the state. So want to talk a little bit about it, what to expect when you're expecting emerald ash borer. So emerald ash borer is this invasive beetle. It's kind of beautiful to some eyes, maybe metallic green color, native to Asia. And since its introduction here to North America has been killing ash trees. And it was first detected in the state in 2009, but since then has moved through most of the state, causing widespread death of ash trees. Now, for most of the state, what we're talking about when we're thinking about emerald ash borer is not a question of what to do when it arrives. It has already been here. It is swept through. And it's really more about what to do in the aftermath of emerald ash borer. And as I'm thinking about that, and I'm sure as you're thinking about that too, there's kind of two sides to that question, two different contexts of how emerald ash borer is impacting things. There's what's going on with those landscape trees in cities, communities, yards everywhere. And then there's what's happening in our forests and natural areas. And I think what emerald ash borer means is really different in those different areas, and you have kind of different tools in the toolbox. So I just wanted to touch on those briefly. Now, joining us today, we have a couple of entomologists who can also provide a lot of information on them, Dr. Besson, and I know Dr. Larson will be on later. And so I wanted to kind of bring some of the forest health side of that, especially since for much of Western Kentucky, emerald ash borer is something that is still arriving or will be there in the near future. So in your homeowner perspective and kind of the landscape perspective when thinking about emerald ash borer and how to respond to it, one of the first questions I would have is assessing the potential damage there. Do you have susceptible trees to begin with? Because emerald ash borer is not going to impact every tree that's out there. It is really an issue for our white and green ash species. The emerald ash borer, it really likes ash, and it has been rapidly killing the white and the green ash. If you don't have ash, you're probably okay. So that's kind of the first step, is to do some tree ID. What are those trees in the yard? Now, emerald ash borer can also cause damage on other species. It's not just white and green ash, blue ash, white fringe tree, some other ash species can also be impacted, although blue ash is less attractive to the emerald ash borer, so there's been observed to be less damage on it. White fringe tree also seems to be less attractive and respond well or better to it, whereas you can pretty much guarantee that your white ash and your green ash are going to be killed by the emerald ash borer in the near future. So after doing that kind of assessment and thinking about, do you have trees that are going to be impacted by the emerald ash borer? The next question I would have for people thinking about what are their options in that landscape setting would be, how damaged are they already? Has the emerald ash borer already caused a lot of damage in these trees or not? So if you were to kind of think about them in terms of their canopy, and yes, the emerald ash borer isn't maybe directly impacting the canopy of the tree. The way that it hurts trees is that its larvae tunnel just under the bark, cutting off the circulation and eventually almost strangling the tree from the inside. All of these larvae tunneling right in that vascular system of the tree. But what you would see visually is thinning of the canopy. And if that canopy is still looking pretty good, still pretty full, those could be candidates for insecticide treatments, systemic insecticide treatment to protect those individual trees from the emerald ash borer. If, however, those canopies are already looking really bad, there's already extensive damage by the emerald ash borer, it's likely too late to have an effective systemic insecticide treatment. Perhaps the reason for that being in that systemic insecticide has to be taken up by the tree and moved systemically throughout it. So imagine you have all these larvae tunneling around in there. It can't really do that. That tree is already, well on death's doorstep, and maybe it's thinking about what to do afterwards, any potential hazard that might be posed by it, and what comes next. But there are really effective insecticide treatments for those healthy trees. A thing to keep in mind is that those need to be repeated regularly for the foreseeable future. Now, what does regularly mean? That's kind of a moving target. When emerald ash borer first comes into an area, its populations can be really high, and you might need to treat more regularly. And then after some time, those populations might decrease and you might have more time between those treatment intervals. At least that's what we're observing in parts of Kentucky where it's been there longer. And there are many different treatments out there for it. And I really recommend, we don't have time to go into some of those details right now, but there's a guide that I really recommend you check out if you're interested in, and I can put this link in the chat. Insecticide options for protecting ash trees from emerald ash borer, a descriptive title. And it'll go through the many different treatments that are out there. Now, homeowners can treat their own trees, especially with some of the imidacloprid options, but there are some other options that will probably be more effective and last longer, or might be a better fit for those larger trees. But those might require hiring a commercial applicator for those if a homeowner is interested in that. And so I, again, recommend that guide that goes through the different types of insecticide options. Another thing to think about is, let's say that that's not going to be something that you're going to pursue. What are your replacement tree options? If you're thinking about replacing a tree, an ash tree that was killed by emerald ash borer in a landscape setting, what did you value about that tree, or what do you want out of a tree in that spot? And always consider the site and the space available. There's no such thing as one perfect tree, of course, but there are better and worse choices for different sites. So ash trees are beautiful trees in our landscape setting and a real loss there, but there are lots of other wonderful large shade trees that you could choose. And really, I think diversity is one of our best buffers from any future invasives that might be headed our way. I know Dr. Larson is going to be talking about some of those invasives lurking just around the corner to keep your eye peeled for. But things like black gum would be one of my favorite landscape trees, or many different oak species, even some of the species that sometimes we think of as not necessarily being the specimen yard trees, like hackberry. They will grow well and they will tolerate poor sites. And of course, I love a Kentucky coffee tree or state heritage tree, and many others. And then in some sites, you might have had an ash there, but you might prefer something smaller. You might be more interested in a yellowwood, or just taking that opportunity to diversify trees and to reconsider what it was that you wanted there. Now, the things I just said are kind of applicable in the landscape setting, but when it comes to your woods or forested areas, you have different considerations there, because For most people, it's not going to be an issue of managing one tree here or there, but thinking about a large number of trees, and that changes your options. So again, assessing potential damage, but in this case, I'm not thinking about individual trees as much as the big picture. How much ash was in this stand to begin with? What was the percentage of ash trees in the woods? So across the state, ash was only 4% of the trees overall, which doesn't seem like much, but that doesn't help you if you're in one of these pockets that had 30, 40% of your trees were ash. That's a huge loss in those areas. And what you really want to see there is, can they transition to something that's going to be valuable, that's going to be beneficial, or is it becoming something that's less valuable? Are there problems with that? And in thinking about that, you know, this big picture of how much ash is there, but also thinking about that locally in one stand or one property. And think about how far along is the damage by emerald ash borer. That really impacts what your options are, what's in that toolbox. Now, I have insecticide listed here, and we did talk about that in a landscape setting. But most woodland owners, that's not going to be economically feasible. There are some people that are doing that and can protect those trees that way. But economically, that's a large cost to be carrying for a large number of trees over time. Is it a good time for a harvest? Maybe. It depends. It depends on what you've got. If you're going to lose your ash trees anyways, but are there other things in there? Is it valuable? Is there a market? And then if you choose to do nothing, how are you going to manage the hazard trees that are left? How are you going to be managing the invasive plants that come up and compete with the more valuable native species you want to be seeing there? All of those are really important considerations in that woodland context for emerald ash borer. So where is emerald ash borer right now? How far along is that damage? Well, here's a map from the Kentucky Division of Forestry of where is emerald ash borer. All of the green counties that have different colors have detected positives of or confirmed positives of emerald ash borer. Does that mean that it's not in these other counties? It means that we don't know about it if it is there. So if you do see it, you can report it, but it is likely to go through there in the near future. Now, there is less ash in this area than there was in some other pockets of the state. But just because you have a tree in one of these counties that's still healthy, unfortunately, it just means the emerald ash borer has probably not gotten to it yet. If you're in this band somewhere around here, you're probably experiencing some level of decline from emerald ash borer, but not all your trees might be dead. It might be somewhere in the middle versus in these areas, you're likely kind of experiencing what happens when all of those trees have been lost. You have a lot of ash regeneration, a lot of little ash trees popping up where the large trees have died. Now, those trees are probably going to be killed when they get big enough as well. So making sure you have other things in there that are valuable. And one thing to note about emerald ash borer is it doesn't actually damage the wood, right? These larvae are tunneling just under the bark. And so you'd think that the wood would be just fine, but as soon as those trees start to go downhill, what we've found is that there's a lot of other insects and fungi that take advantage of those conditions. So here's some lumber, some ash that was milled up, thinking it would be fine. It was killed by emerald ash borer and it was standing dead for maybe 6 months, but it is riddled with tiny little holes from various beetles, fungi associated with those. So really, you've got a short window of time to harvest those trees once they are infested with emerald ash borer and still retain their value. So that's something to be thinking about in advance. You don't want to wait too late and lose that value that's there. So just thinking about emerald ash borer, you should be thinking about laying the foundation for your woods post emerald ash borer. That might be considering a harvest and working with a forester on that. It will definitely be watching for invasive plants and removing them early, because what we've found is that those invasive plants that were just hanging out in the understory, before emerald ash borer. Afterwards, they have more sunlight, they can grow faster and outcompete the native species and become a real problem. And another thing to think about in our woodland setting is dealing with hazardous trees. So I think a lot of folks, if they didn't do anything about emerald ash borer on the front end, they were left with really hazardous conditions in their woods, making it tough to get in there, to do anything, whether it's enjoy their woods or certainly any hope of harvesting that. Ash trees fall apart fast and they snap in half, drop branches, create dangerous conditions. So just to give you a sense of this, this is a stand at a natural area near me. And in this photo, what you can see are all of these are ash trees that have already snapped in half or experienced some failure. And then this is just a whole bunch of them waiting to go. And you can imagine that that's created some really frustrating conditions for landowners who weren't really expecting, not only was it going to kill their trees, but it was really going to shape how they could interact with their woods. So I encourage you, as you're thinking about emerald ash borer coming through, especially in Western Kentucky, emerald ash borer is bad, but there's a lot that can be done to set the stage for a bright future. And we're fortunate in that we have lots of different tree species that can take the place of ash when it's gone. But you may need to take a more active role in ensuring that those ones that you want are there instead of some invasives or species you don't want there. And so with that, I'm going to move on from emerald ash borer to just briefly talking about laurel wilt disease. So laurel wilt disease is a new disease that's been detected in the state in 2019. And laurel wilt, LWD, is a disease. It is caused by an invasive fungus that is transported by an invasive insect, the red bay ambrosia beetle. So you've got this disease, you're seeing, wilted leaves, in this case of sassafras. It's caused by the fungus, which you can see as this black streaky staining under the bark of the tree. And if we were to look, and you can see this black streaky staining in this cross section that I've got in my hand here, this black coloration, but also there's this tunnel here. And if we were to follow that in, we would find this tiny, tiny little red bay ambrosia beetle, an invasive insect that's carrying that fungus around with it. Now the beetle is tiny, tiny and very hard to see. And just one beetle is needed to introduce this fungus, and that can kill the tree. So once the fungus gets in there, it can rapidly kill those trees. So what might you look for with laurel wilt disease? One of the easiest to see symptoms, I think, is early fall color. So imagine you have this fungus, it's clogging up the vascular system of the tree. It looks like the plant is water stressed, because it is. And in sassafras, its primary host in our area, that's going to be bright red colors. You might also just see a bunch of dead trees on the side of the road. That is what I have noticed, because sassafras really likes to grow in those fence rows. And all of a sudden, a lot of them are now dead. And then if you were to cut into that bark, you'd see that black, really distinctive, streaky black staining. That's the fungus, as well as the trees trying to defend itself from the fungus, and combined really shutting off its circulation that way. So a couple other things that you could look for, maybe if you have really good eyesight, you might see some tiny little holes that are caused by the beetle that's boring in there and that's introduced the fungus, or these tiny toothpicks that are the boring dust that the beetle makes as it's boring and tunneling through those trees. But a lot of times with laurel wilt, I've found that these you don't really notice. You will notice the dead tree first, and then look around and try to think, where are those beetle holes? Now, laurel wilt has been known sometime in further south of us. Along the coast here, it has decimated red bay laurels, as well as other species. And that's where the name comes from. It causes disease on the true laurels, which in our area is only sassafras and spicebush. But further south, there are different species, including avocado. And it has been a major problem for that industry. Now, while we don't have to worry about that here, you can see that it was first detected here in 2019, and since then has been detected throughout many different parts of Kentucky, and it's probably in other areas and we just don't know about it yet, killing sassafras as well as spicebush. So initially coastal areas, more recently up here. In our region, it's going to likely kill off our sassafras, spicebush as well, especially when it's growing with large sassafras. I think the jury's still out for what it's going to mean for spicebush overall. The beetle that transmits this prefers larger diameter trees, and spicebush is a small bush, while sassafras is a big tree. So I don't really know what to expect. We are monitoring that to try to see long-term what it means. And further south and in other parts of the world, it's likely going to impact lots of different species. So what can we do about it? We can slow its spread. It likely got up to us from further south, someone bringing in contaminated firewood or material. So really keeping in mind, things like laurel wilt can be hiding in that and you'd never notice it. Those beetles are tiny, right? You could accidentally move it around really easily. And then of course, sassafras can be moved lots of different ways, whether it's in nursery stock, for woodworking or other, but really slowing its spread is going to be important for restricting it. Recognizing those symptoms and reporting them early for different areas. If you see dead sassafras, if you're seeing a lot of dead sassafras, early fall color, reporting that to your county agent, to your forester, to let them know that it might be in new areas. And then there is potential for fungicide treatment of trees to protect trees from infection. Currently, there are a couple different propiconazole treatments, but I will say, I think there's still a lot of research that needs to be done there. We are working on some of that, but it's likely something that's going to need to be done regularly. Currently, there are some on-label treatments for sassafras and others, like a trunk injection with propizol or a trunk injection of alamo, and you can kind of see there a macro injector with fungicide. But I think, in terms of how long that's going to last and how feasible that is, there's still a lot we don't know. And as always follow the label on that. The label is the law. And hopefully we'll have some more updates on other fungicide application techniques in the near future from some of our trials. And then one last thing I want to ask of you is to look for trees with resistance. In the areas where laurel wilt has been detected, we've seen 100% mortality of sassafras, which has been really sad. But we are on the lookout for sassafras that's still alive and healthy when everything else has been dead. Hopefully it has some genetic resistance that is protecting it from that, and that can be used in the future to breed trees that are going to be able to withstand this new invasive threat. If you see any of those, you can report them with the Tree Snap app. And if you download that app, which I promise I won't send you any spam. It's an app that myself and some colleagues made for exactly this kind of thing, trying to find trees that are still out there when an invasive has come in and wiped them out for the most part. Things like chestnut and ash and now sassafras. So if you see it, you can report it with the Tree Snap app. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and just again recommend that if people have woodland health questions, questions about the trees in their forests and natural areas, there's a lot of resources out there across the state that you can go to, from your county extension agents to extension specialists like myself with Forest Health, Billy Thomas for woodland owners, and Jonathan Larson, who's going to be speaking later. I know from an entomology perspective, you're going to be hearing about more forest health threats. Don't worry. If you thought there weren't enough invasives out there attacking our trees, you'll hear about a few more in a couple minutes. To the Kentucky Division of Forestry, both their forest health coordinator, Alexander Blevins, who you can see here, as well as their service foresters do a lot and can provide a lot of kind of technical expertise on different things. There are consulting foresters who are available to assist. There are various technical service providers, and there are several cost share funding opportunities through NRCS for woodland health issues. And finally, I want to recommend that any woodland owners who are out there, they can join the Kentucky Woodland Owners Association and learn from other woodland owners. about the issues that you're having in your woods. So with that, I just want to wrap it up. And if we have time for any questions, take those. Also encourage you to check out at Kentucky Forest Health, at KY Forest Health on social media, if you'd like to learn more.